Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy, and science.
Okay, well, thanks for coming here. Quite surprised there's that many people. Who's from Newcastle University here, just out of interest? Okay, a significant number, right. I've never been to Newcastle before, beautiful city, I saw it today. Never been north of Birmingham before, except Sweden, of course, where I'm from. So today I then have 20 minutes to quickly go through 2,000 years of psychedelic philosophy. So it's going to be quick. I gave a talk last week, 13 minutes, so it's going to be an expanded version of that. I was told that there's no slides, it's convivial, sort of casual, so please think about questions as I speak, but give me 20 minutes first. With the questions as well, I'd be happy to talk about anything in the philosophy of mind, really, consciousness, such as mental causation, epiphenomenalism, whatever it may be, ethics, nihilism, whatnot. All of it is related. Right, so I shall begin. So this talk is called The Power of Psychedelics on Philosophy. It's going to consist of three main parts, really. Just an introduction of psychedelic experience, phenomenology, the history, hidden history of psychedelic philosophy, and then some speculations about the future and how psychedelics might inform the studies of consciousness generally. So, first of all then, psychedelics and their phenomenology. Well, by the word psychedelic, we understand chemicals such as LSD, DMT, mescaline, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, salvia divinorum, and so on and so forth. But I'll expand that word, a word coined by Humphrey Osmond in the 50s, to include other drugs which are also psychoactive and have very similar effects in terms of visualization and feelings and so on. So I'll also include opium, which at high enough doses can basically be very similar to the classic psychedelics, nitrous oxide, chloral hydrate, and some others, as we shall see. Now, I'm sure that none of you have experienced psychedelics here before, so I'm just going to just introduce you to what I mean by it. So when I talk about psychedelic experience, when I speak to a number of people, at least, they think it's like a kaleidoscopic vision of colors, and that's about it. It's so much more. I mean, that's part of it, but that's only a very small part of it. One can experience the sublime, the absolute beautiful, much more than one can in normal prosaic consciousness, as it were. One experiences, or can experience, completely novel states of mind. Even that word is perhaps stretching it. As a result, we talk about the ineffability of psychedelic states, a word that William James used for the mystical experience. In other words, that you can't fully describe the experience because, of course, it's not common, so there do not exist words to convey their meaning. One can experience states of synesthesia, so one smells the color of time, things like this. I remember that from my TED talk last week. I was quite pleased with that. Very common to experience self-loss in many different ways. So the self can shatter into, I remember on psilocybin, in a legal context, I became 5 different selves. Sometimes one believes one becomes one with the universe, loses oneself like that. Ego loss, it's also known as. One can experience states of non-desire, which is quite interesting when one considers philosophers like Spinoza, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, who say that desire is the essence of the person. One can also experience terror, absolute horrific, nightmarish terror. I've been there and quite enjoyed it, so it's not always bad. But it's not for everyone. Now, interesting, we're currently living in interesting times with regards to psychedelics, I think, because philosophy's come to the point, and science, where we now accept that consciousness is a worthy subject to study. The Australian philosopher Chalmers, in 1996, renamed this mind-matter problem as the hard problem of consciousness. In other words, how does consciousness, the intangible mind, as it were, relate to solid physical matter? A very, very old problem, but it's got a new name. We are we are concurrently in the midst of the psychedelic renaissance. So there's a lot more advanced research on the properties of these substances, much more advanced than it was in the 60s. And the interesting thing there really is that in the 1960s, when there was the first sort of Western psychedelic thing, philosophy of mind was very reductive. So theories like behaviorism, which is that the mind doesn't really exist, it's sort of the words just relate to behavior. So if I say happy, it really relates to smiling and jumping and laughing and so on. Psychoneural identity theory. A lot of the philosophy of language wanted to reduce away consciousness to something other than itself. And as a result, it's quite a pity, really, that happened concurrently with the first 1960s psychedelic burst, because it was kind of ignored. Not always, there are some exceptions. For example, John Smithies, who I'll mention in a moment, he was pushing it, and he was very critical of behaviorism, psychoneural identity theory, and so on. If I'm using words, by the way, which you don't understand, that can be a question afterwards, right? But now, when we accept that consciousness is a real, I shouldn't say thing, is real, and now at the same time when we're looking at psychedelic properties, it seems like there's a whole new world that philosophy can explore here and take it more seriously than it has been taken before. Okay, so there's a little introduction. Now I'm going to go through a bit of history. So I mentioned the 1960s, but the use of psychoactive drugs has happened far before that. Humphrey Davy, for example, I travelled from Penzance yesterday, 14 hours, not so pleasant, but from Penzance. And Humphrey Davy, for example, in 1799, scientifically studied psychoactive drugs. But before that even, we can go all the way to the ancient Greeks and consider Plato. Now, I haven't got time to sort of prove this in much detail, but in ancient Greece, there was a religious... Is that just me, or is it... I don't think I've taken anything yet. Right. Yeah, so back to Greece. In ancient Greece, there was a formal religious event called the Eleusinian Mysteries, held every year, a larger one and a lesser one. And it was held in Eleusis, which is about 13 miles away from Athens. And in this festival, as it were, of which all Greeks partook, one would take, a lot of things happened, but the relevant point is one would take a potion of a specific dose after one had fasted, and thereafter see visions. And when we look at Plato's work, we can see that he speaks about mystical states. In the Phaedo, on the soul, where Plato introduces his idea of dualism, that the body and the mind are separate, he prefaces that by saying that he himself wants to be considered as one of the mystics. And then he goes into rational reasons for believing in dualism, which is the notion, as I said, that mind and matter are distinct substances, which means that when the body dies, the soul can survive. In the Phaedrus, another book by Plato, he gives, by the way, the book, the Phaedrus, starts at the river Ilissos, which is where the lesser mysteries were held. The mysteries, I should say, you were not allowed to speak about openly. But nonetheless, in the Phaedrus, Plato gives what's possibly one of the first trip reports in history. He writes this. This is just a fragment. We saw the blessed sight and vision, and were initiated into that which is rightly called the most blessed of mysteries. We looked upon perfect apparitions, which we saw in the pure light, being ourselves pure, not entombed in this which we carry about with us and call the body, in which we are imprisoned like an oyster in its shell. So it is possible, though it can't be proved, that Plato took some kind of psychoactive substance, this kykion as it's known, experienced this mind-body dualism, these apparitions as pure light, and thereafter tried to rationalize it through his arguments for dualism. Albert Hofmann, the chemist who discovered LSD, argued that the kykion, the potion that Plato and ancient Greeks took, contained ergot, which is a fungus that grows off wheat and barley, and right next to the Eleusinian Mysteries were the Rarian plains, where those crops were grown. So it's possible. There are other theories as well, and some people don't believe it was psychoactive at all. But looking at all of the evidence, I think it's more likely than not. if that is the case, and if we take into consideration Alfred North Whitehead's famous dictum that the safest, God, I'll try to remember this now, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato, then we can sort of conjecture that psychedelics started off Western philosophy. After the Eleusinian mysteries were closed down by Emperor Theodosius I in the 4th century AD, Roman Christian. Thereafter, it didn't fully stop. We see Neoplatonists talk about mysteries. We see people like Plotinus talk about mystical states. And the last Neoplatonist of the 5th century AD, Proclus, spoke about these Eleusinian mysteries happening secretly. Of course, at the time, there was a lot of persecution of the pagan religions by the Christians, an historical inversion. But an interesting thing Proclus says is that the visions had at the mysteries were with eyes closed. And that shows that it's, again, another indicator that the potion taken was psychoactive. But then Christianity comes, it closes down these pagan rituals and whatever, and we enter, as it's known, the Dark Ages. Moving on a few centuries, as I've got a few minutes. Oh God, 15 minutes already, I just started. Okay, so I mentioned Humphrey Davy. So in 1799, Humphrey Davy, self-proclaimed chemical philosopher, decides, actually is sent to investigate whether nitrous oxide is toxic or not. He soon discovers that it is not. In fact, quite the opposite, it's quite pleasant. Unlike the carbon monoxide he also tried, which he didn't find very pleasant. Davy was taking 15 pints, for half the year, 1799, Humphrey Davy was taking 15 pints of nitrous oxide 5 times a day, every day. Which is, pretty impressive for today's standards even. But that was not enough for him. On Boxing Day, 1799, Davy steps inside a human-sized airtight box designed by James Watt and takes 160 pints of nitrous oxide. As he steps out, he takes another 40 pints for good measure from a silk bag. And then he writes this. Or it says this, and he wrote it in his book of 1800. Where is it? Yeah, okay. My visible impressions were dazzling and apparently magnified. I heard distinctly every sound in the room. I lost all connection with external things. I existed in a world of newly connected and newly modified ideas. With the most belief and prophetic manner, I exclaimed, "Nothing exists but thoughts. The universe is composed of impressions, ideas, pleasures, and pains." What he was alluding to there, as we can see from his notebooks, is the philosophy of idealism, which is the view that, very basically, the material world doesn't exist. It's a mental projection, as it were. At the time, Davy was hanging around with Wordsworth and Coleridge and Southey, all of whom were very interested in German idealism. And it's interesting that they spoke about then idealism. It's interesting that he thought that nitrous oxide brought him to a sort of direct idealist position. Academic philosophy in Britain didn't become really idealist until the 1870s. So they were pioneers, as it were. By the way, I should say Davy's final book called Confessions, The Last Days of a Philosopher, Confessions and Travel. The first chapter is called The Vision, which in those days generally meant an opium vision. And in that, he goes through the history of the world, then he flies into space, meets aliens and whatnot. It's an amazing book, like I say, written in 1829. And in it, he gives this great analogy for the psychedelic experience that we can use today. He writes this, when looking, by the way, at a spectacular alien city sprouting glass columns with aliens moving about in it. He says this, "You are now in a state in which a fly would be, whose microscopic eye was changed to one similar to that of man, and you are wholly unable to associate what you now see with your former knowledge." In other words, what it's like to be a fly being a man is akin to what it's like for a man to be tripping psychedelic. De Quincey was a contemporary of Davy, they're acquainted a little bit. De Quincey wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, where opium, the base of heroin and so on, and morphine, causes unbelievably beautiful visions of beautiful cities and whatnot. Later, William James is also the great psychologist, philosopher William James also brought idealism through nitrous oxide, just like Davy. In fact, James writes that he only fully understood Hegel's idealism through nitrous oxide. I never say this to my students, but I've tried it, and I think it works. Or at least I think it works at the time, and then I've got no idea what it's all about, really. Nietzsche as well, a contemporary of James. Nietzsche's, God is dead, blah, I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He was a massive drug fiend. I mean, he was taking large doses of opium, potassium bromide, chloral hydrate, a secretive Javanese narcotic, his sister alleges. Interesting, chloral hydrate and potassium bromide is what the great writer Evelyn Waugh took, and what caused him these hallucinations, which is represented in his book, The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, where he's on a cruiser and he thinks everyone's sort of conspiring to kill him and so on. Nietzsche was taking exactly the same concoction as Evelyn Waugh. Of course, Nietzsche went mad in 1889. People think it was syphilis. Other people think it was brain cancer. No one's really sure. But his sister, who looked after him for 10 years, and his mother, both believe it was due to excessive drug use. But because his sister's not widely respected, people are skeptical. But I suddenly think it was a factor. Of course, he was taking medication because he was already ill. His father died of softening of the brain when he was 5. But it seemed to be a horrific cycle of some kind of disease, perhaps syphilis, perhaps brain cancer, mixed with high doses of potent drugs. Of course, as well, Nietzsche, though he said God is dead, he always, he used the god of intoxication, Dionysus, in his works and claimed inspiration therefrom. We can talk about this much more detail later. Moving on, Jean-Paul Sartre. He wanted, Sartre, I should say. Is that horrible to pronounce, Sartre? It doesn't sound right. But he in 1935, he was really in a sorry state, completely uninspired. So he decided to take a large injection of mescaline, characterist drug mescaline. And this did lead to his essay on imagination, and eventually to his book Nausea, which made him famous. It did have a cost. For a few months thereafter, he noticed that he was being followed by giant lobsters everywhere. He knew they were not real, but it brought little comfort because it made him think he was going permanently insane. But it passed. A couple of decades later, John Smithies, who I mentioned, is not a very well-known philosopher. He's also a neuroscientist. Humphrey Osmond, who coined the word psychedelic, and Aldous Huxley, who wrote Doors Perception, wanted to get together the world's leading cognoscenti to each try mescaline and write about it. It's called the Outsight Project. It almost happened. They didn't get funding from the Ford Foundation in the last minute, unfortunately, but invitees included H.H. Price, A.J. Ayer, Carl Jung, and Albert Einstein even. So that was the greatest thing that never happened in psychedelia, unfortunately. 10 years later, Timothy Leary makes it public. It becomes very popular in the 60s, and then gets criminalized, unfortunately. But if only that Outsight Project had happened, I think today we'd be thinking about these drugs in completely different terms. I could mention A.J. Ayer, I won't because of time. I can mention a few others. Something we can talk about in questions is the relationship between psychedelics and metaethics or nihilism. Bertrand Russell wrote about that a bit, Octavio Paz. Terence McKenna, who's not really a proper philosopher, but a very interesting fellow, he wrote a lot about psychedelics, and he said the philosopher under which one should study psychedelics is Alfred North Whitehead. That's what I've been doing a bit, looking at Alfred North Whitehead's fantastic metaphysics in relation to the psychedelic experience. Again, I can talk about that a bit later. So there is just a very abridged history of how drugs have influenced, inspired philosophers of the past. What's the future hold? Well, at the moment, most psychedelic studies are on therapy, on the medicinal use of psychedelics, which looks promising. But I think psychedelics are much more than that. Like I say, they can give us direct experiences of philosophies that are only ever theoretically proposed, such as idealism. The future also, a lot of people who take psychedelics become enamored to nature, gain a much greater respect for the natural world, which is useful for our current state. In philosophy, there's something called transhumanism, the sort of view that humanity should evolve. Interestingly, the person who coined the term cosmic consciousness, R.M. Buck, was in a sense a transhumanist, and he saw mystical states as means to evolve humanity. Again, something else we can talk about. A.R. Araj, a Nietzsche scholar as well. They just generally provide richer lives. You know, people say, I don't need psychedelics to have a good life. It was a bit like saying, well, I don't need music to have a good life. Yeah, you don't need it, but you know, it sort of just adds value to your life. So it's got positive benefit. It's not only a negative benefit in terms of being able to help people. It can actually improve one's life. Not always, but often. Also, I believe that it can, like I've sort of been indicating all along, it can provide tools and phenomenology in which we can develop rich mind-matter theories. A Whitehead scholar named Charles Hartshorne said we should always be aware of the prosaic fallacy, thinking that consciousness is limited to those states that we normally have, prosaically have. Psychedelics immediately show us that that is not the case, and thus make us open to other theories of mind, such as panpsychism, the view that all entities have a very basic element of mind, not consciousness, but mind. So that's 25 minutes, but I'll leave it there. A lot of questions, I'm sure. Thank you.